Yes, hello everybody and welcome back to Tent 2. We will now have a panel or talk about transactivism across generations. Of course, you will, as you have previously been able to, ask questions here in the tent or through the live stream. And Nico, will you please introduce your panel and yourself?
I will. Thank you everyone who's here in the tent for joining us, and thank you to everyone who's joining us through the live streaming or watching at a later point. My name is Nico. My pronouns are they, them, and I am part of the board of Transaction, which is an organization for and by trans people. And this panel is a collaboration between Transaction and my PhD project on queer and trans activism, and we have been doing a couple of workshops, the four of us, where we have been sharing our reflections and experiences with trans activism throughout different time periods and focused on different struggles. And so today, since it's quite a short period of time, usually our workshops have been, like 3 or 4 hours, so we really have time to discuss. But today it's only an hour, so instead of having time to really go into the different types of activism that we've been involved in, we want to share some meta-reflections about doing trans activism and being involved in trans communities across generations and different age spans. So I would, just thank you all three again for wanting to have this conversation in this space. And please, if you want to introduce yourselves as well. Yeah, you can start, Ferndan.
It's so weird to listen to myself. I'm a little bit nervous, but thank you for being here. My name is Ferndan. My pronouns are she, her. And I've been a trans activist for a long time. Back home in Guatemala, I'm a refugee in Denmark. And also in Denmark, I have my share of activism. So I hope I can tell you a little bit more about my work with the questions we're going to get tonight. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elias, and I use the pronouns he, him. And I've been doing a lot of different queer activism the last 10 years, but what's most important here, I think, is my activism since 2014 until 18 with the group Transaktivisme, which I'm a co-founder of, and we made a lot of activism trying to fight for trans-specific healthcare. And I'm not going to say a lot about that right now, but I could talk about that for hours, but I think that's the most important thing right now.
Hi, and my name is Elizabeth, she and her, I think it's called. And I don't know where to start, and so I'm just going to make it very short. I could say very shortly that when I was young, there was no place to be active. So that was quite simple, I didn't do anything. And then later on, luckily, things changed in the middle of the 1990s. Suddenly something happened, so I joined whatever there was to join, I would say. And that's about it.
Thank you, everyone. And so some of the conversations that we've been having, both in the workshops, but also between the workshops, revolve around our own experiences with doing activism and also sometimes struggling to even gain access to communities and activism. And so the first question that we want to talk about today is sharing a little bit about some of the knowledges and experiences and tools that we were all that we were missing when we started doing activism. So I don't know who's up for starting with that question. Yeah? Go ahead.
I think we were discussing today earlier before is that I'm a little bit jealous of the communication that we can access today. Like when I started 20 years ago, very, very, very young. We didn't have the knowledge or the access to the knowledge that we have today. And I think I missed a lot of information. I think my identity grew up with the movement in Guatemala. We started to work together and to define our identity in the run. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know, and not only because I was young. It's not like a coming of age story. It's simply like you didn't have the name or the box where you could feel comfortable. And also, I think like the options that we had in that time to define ourselves was very much into the binary. Like, I transitioned very young, and then I just had the option to become a woman. It's like now when I hear non-binary or third gender or many other expressions to make identity and gender a spectrum instead of a binary thing, I feel more identified with that. But then I did have to make a decision, and I live very comfortable now as a woman and a very happy life. But I think I would have liked to have all the information that we have now, because if there was a show like Pose 20 years ago, my life would have been so much easier. And I would have jumped to my definition of a human being easier and smoother. Yeah, definitely.
Should we just take it this way, or yeah, you want to go, Elias?
I'll just continue what you're saying, Ferndan. I think when I started doing especially transactivism, when I think about it now, I really missed my own history. I didn't know actually who fought before me, what did we fight for before, and how did people do that. And I think that a lot of mistakes that I have been making in my activism could have been, I didn't have to make these mistakes actually if I had someone to talk to who could tell me what they did before me and how they did it. And it felt like that we were starting from scratch. And of course we weren't, because we were standing on the shoulders of so many queer and trans people before us, but I didn't knew that. And that would have helped me, and a lot of people came to me and our group and said that we were doing something wrong, and we were, but we didn't know that. And so much energy we used on things that we actually didn't have to spend our energy on. So it would have been so nice to have some older trans people I could talk to about these things. And also so I knew that I actually had a place in the world, that we were there, we existed, and we existed long before I came, and I didn't know that. And I think that I maybe sometimes came off a little bit arrogant and a little bit too angry also to the older people, the older trans people before me, because I didn't actually really respect their history and their fights because I didn't know them. So that would have been really nice to have that, to know that.
Actually, I don't know what to say. I think I might say that when I was young, there was nobody. I think I almost said that before. And when there is nobody around you which you can relate to, then you cannot develop an identity. I recently found out that the word identity means the same as, you might like, you're a Danish person, for instance, or not a Danish person, but at least there's somebody you can say, well, I'm not Danish, or I'm not German, or I'm whatever, you know. But when you're a transgendered person before the internet in a small Danish town, well, you don't know nothing, and you have nothing to relate to. There's nobody that can answer you what is right and what is wrong. When the first time I found out that maybe I started thinking about it. I came into the living room of my parents' house, and on the radio they talked about venereal diseases and Danish kønssygdomme. So I thought that, well, That's the reason. I have a venereal disease, jeg har en kønssygdom. Because I didn't know any other words. I had no clue that it was a very dangerous situation to be in, to have a venereal disease. There were no words. So that's very important to have a community. And actually I think that most transgender people in Denmark only have online communities. Most of us don't have the privilege of sitting here and being able to sharing our thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. This is a conversation that we've been having also in the workshops, like how much access to internet communities and online communities have meant for many of us in terms of being able to find a place where we can organize and where we can relate to other people. And I think some of the discussions that we've been having have also been related to, as you also mentioned, Elias, the struggles that have come before us. And so, for instance, in Denmark, it's there are very few books and very few archives where you can have access to queer and trans history. And so I remember, like, for instance, when being involved in access to activism related to access to trans-specific healthcare, we had to spend a lot of time trying to get to know all the medical guidelines, get to know okay, which were the struggles that happened 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and I used the few people that I knew who were a bit older than me, or who I knew who had been around or had been part of those struggles, but I also lacked a lot of access to other people or to written sources, because if you don't have that personal access to a community, then it's even harder to find access to our history and to the struggles that people have been involved in before us. So I'm also wondering, when reflecting on this, which are the experiences or knowledges or tools that you would like to pass on to new activists or people who start getting involved in the communities or in different groups and different kinds of activism? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think the biggest impact in my life about activism was media, how the media managed my story, how I became kind of known, or my case became kind of known, and that brought to the table other issues about trans people, not only migration and asylum, but also healthcare, because my story had many problematics that many trans people was facing at the time. That was 10 years ago. But the thing is, media gave me an image. I couldn't decide how I was going to be portrayed. I could tell my story, but what they did is victimize me, right? I was a poor little girl coming from Guatemala. Nobody loves her. And it was a tragic story, but I didn't want to be portrayed like a victim because I'm a survivor, right? And I'm a feminist. There's so many other things about me that in the media got lost because all I was is a trans person. So I would say you need ever in contact in any media, in any social media, everywhere, you need to reclaim your story and you need to make it yourself and have a image that makes more fidelity to who you are as a human being, instead of I know trans issues are important, but if we want to be seen as a whole, we need to also highlight the other characteristics of ourselves that makes us fantastic as a human being. I'm not just a trans person. I'm, first of all, a woman. That is my identity. I'm a woman of color that happens to be trans. that happens to have an experience different or not so different from other women. And that is what should be out there, instead of like, if you Google me, there's these horrible details about my life, because sadly I went through so many things. But I would like to people to own their story and to teach them to be themselves, no matter where, and make trans relevant in the human part, not as an object or as a fetish or as a sad story. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also think I have two things that I if I should say what I want to pass on to younger generations of activists, I would say, just like you said, Fernanda, like different kind of strategies to get out there with your activism. Like you have to use different kind of strategies. If you're talking to media, you have to use one strategy. If you're talking to politicians, you're gonna use another strategy. And you have to like all the time balance your own values with how far do I want to get out. I used a lot of anger in my activism, and that is a really good drive. Like that's really good motivation for doing something, but people don't want to listen to you if you're really angry, especially not the media. So you have to like, I developed certain kind of strategies to get out there. And I think that's really important to learn other people how to do that, and how to like just like make them know that you can use different kind of strategies to get out there. And also that brings me to point number 2, to take care of yourself. Because a lot of the activists burned out. I burned out. It's too hard. It's so fucking hard to be out there all the time, because we are presenting something really political, while like fighting for trans-specific healthcare. That's really political, but it's at the same time a really personal matter. And if you talk to the media, they want your story, like your personal story, and they want to victimize you all the time. And it's too fucking hard to be in. But sometimes you have to do it to make them listen, but then you have to figure out how to take care of yourself at the same time. And you need a community, and you need somebody to talk to, and different kind of strategies. And I would love to share some of those strategies to make sure that people take care of themselves and can actually be in this kind of activism for more than 4 years without fucking burning out. And I couldn't even like go to Netto afterwards, because I was so...
It's exhausting.
Yeah, I was so exhausted. And I really hope that the people after me don't get to that state of mind, because it's too hard. So I think that's really important, that we teach each other about self-care also.
I just want to add that sometimes you just have to also work with what you are given to, you know? It's like whenever I would have the opportunity of someone victimize me but gave me a voice like that, I would use it, because activism is not only wearing a flag, is also using the opportunities you are given to, and try to amplify your voice and the voice of many others that are having the same experience, and use what you're given. Like, it is true that we want strategies, and we are like amazing to do it and to come up with them, but sometimes the opportunity is not given, so just use what you are given. Yeah, and I think that is very important also.
Maybe I'm repeating myself, I do not hope so, but I would like to take a step back before the activism, and the first step is not to be alone in your home and being afraid of what everybody wants to say if they see you the way you really want to be seen, which is the basic neurosis or fear, which is not a neurosis, it's an actual fact. You're afraid of being beat up on the street if you wear the clothes you want, and you're afraid whether your mother or parent will ever love you, which is the worst fear that exists in a person's life, is to lose the love of your parents. So the first thing is to find somebody you can trust. And from then on, you can build everything, according to my mind. It really means that if you find somebody you can trust, you can do everything. If you're alone, you can do nothing. And that's the most basic thing.
Yeah, and I think like this conversation also highlights how activism can be so many different things. So it's not only when you're talking to media or when you're fighting to change medical guidelines, it's also creating a community for each other and reaching out to each other and surviving and being who we are. Yeah. One topic that I remember that we have reflected on earlier in the workshops that we've also shared different strategies about is how we have dealt with not only media but also collaborators and allies who are not necessarily trans organizations or trans activists. I'm wondering if any of you would like to share some of your strategies or reflections on how to do that.
Well, I'm very bad at it. I mean, my problem is that I've been doing this for so long, and it's so frustrating that the change is so slow. So I'm constantly angry all the time. And when you deal with other people who have very little knowledge about gender identity or migration or whatever other intersectionality, I do not deal well because I'm very direct, and the cultural thing sadly comes up. Like, I feel like in Denmark it's very difficult to have a confrontation. In Latin America, we don't run from a fight. We can enjoy it sometimes, right? And I enjoy a good fight, and I enjoy a good argument, and I want to go in depth with that. So the difficulties, more than how to deal with, that I found is that people in Denmark generally run from a confrontation, and it's so frustrating, right? It's like right in front of them and you want to get through it. So that's why it's so difficult for me to work with organizations, because I am very open about what I think, and I think it's not well received. So I wouldn't change that about me or anyone anyway, but I think that's why you need people to work with, like Elizabeth was saying, to find community, because we have different strengths. And I would say, how would I deal with allies and politicians and things like that? Is like I would send you to talk to them, you know? And I would do something else. That is also important to know your pros and cons, you know? And like, to be very strong in your pros and shut up when you have to is important also to know when to send someone else. And I believe as activists, at least me, I love protagonism. I love to talk. I love to be in the front line of fighting and smelling the blood. But it's important also to know when you have to step back and send someone else who have different qualities and a better approach to allies and all the other things. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one example. I have many, but I have one really good one. When we in Transaktivisme Forum we were collaborating with Amnesty International in a campaign called Sygt System. And it was because we were at this time trying to change the guidelines for trans-specific healthcare. And we were a very tiny group of trans people, and it was very, very difficult to get through and get out there because nobody listened, nobody cared. We're not that many people, and it's not the most like sexy thing to fight for, so the politicians didn't care, the media didn't care, nobody cared. But then Amnesty International actually wanted to fight this fight with us. And then we said yes to do that with them, because then we knew that we could come out, because it's a really big organization and people listen to them. But then we also had to compromise because that meant that we couldn't like make the big lines for this campaign. They did it. And we wouldn't get paid for our work. They are getting paid, but we wouldn't get paid. And we really tried to get paid for our work, but that didn't work. But then we had some conditions. And then we were like, okay, if we want to go through with this, then we have these conditions. We are going to be at every meeting you have with the politicians. Like, we don't want you to go to the meetings with politicians without us. And you are not going to the media without checking in with us before. We are going to tell you what to say, and you are our puppets. They don't know that, like, out in the world, they don't know that, but we are going to tell you what to say. And if you can say yes to that, then we're going to collaborate with you. And you will get all the honor and all the glory, and that's okay, but as long as we know that we actually did this, all the trans people behind you did this, and it's okay. And that was I think that was a good strategy, but it was also really hard to do that, but that's some way to do it. And that was actually really good also because they actually, I think they were really respectful, and we also got to teach all their faces and stuff like that. So we knew that when they went out to the street talking about this campaign, then they used the right words and the right terms. And so, yeah, that was a way of doing it.
It just gets so frustrating because you go and say like, oh, can we please have this right? Or can you please change the guidelines? And can I do please whatever I want with my body? And it gets so frustrating. And it gets to a point where, of course, you receive whatever help that you can get, but I sometimes wish that we could change that position and say, like, we are not saying please anymore. We are just asking for what we are granted just because we are human beings, period, right? But this slow motion, I think, is also side of the attitude towards how to get things, because we need to be cheerleaders and be aggressive, I guess. And it gets a little frustrating when you get some allies like Amnesty, like they didn't work with my case, for example, because I was human trafficked and they didn't want to do anything with prostitution in that time, for example. Now they changed their position, thanks God. But it's so frustrating when you ally to people because they try to tame you and they try to cut the rough side of your personality to make you more softer and more likable and whatever the hell all the time women have to go through. I mean, it's degrading at some point. So I think, like, young people should come with another strategy and be more angry and be more aggressive about it, because I guess it worked a little bit for us, but it didn't really work. So it's time for new ways of asking, yeah, or taking.
And maybe this actually takes us smoothly into the next question that we wanted to reflect on or talk about. Because now we've been talking a little bit about anger and how that can be a motivating factor in activism. Touched a little bit upon burnout. And so when we were talking before the panel, we talked about how it can also be tiring to continue to be angry, and maybe at some point you get so frustrated that you need a break, or you need some new people or some new energy. And so the next question that we wanted to reflect a little bit upon is both why we think that there are so many age gaps within the trans community, so why a lot of groups are sort of divided into people who are roughly the same age, and also a little bit about what we lose by that when we don't have so much connection across age spans or generations. Elizabeth, would you like to start maybe this time, or?
The good thing about being invited to a thing like this is that you have to think about something. Like you have to say, oh, is that a good question? Why is there an age gap here? So I was wondering about that question, and then I realized, as I am the oldest in the room, that I recall how horrible things were when I was a child. Have you ever seen any? I think you don't. But maybe you have watched any of those programs on the Danish national television about how it was in the old days. I tell you, it was horrible. Women were supposed to sit with their knees together. Men were supposed to be very strong and stupid. And the schools were horrible. The teachers were really horrible. And nobody cares about how the kids were feeling. Actually, the last part is not really true. There were always good people. And then I was also wondering, what has changed since 1950s? I think at least two very basic things have changed. First of all, the women's liberation, which is a huge step forward. Like, I have had the luck of having a mother who had an education, but most women did not have an education. And the working classes women, of course, they were working because they didn't have the money to not work. But every middle class family's ideal was to have a mother in the home. And suddenly, sometimes in the 60s, the women started to get an education. Of course, it was first of all the middle classes who got an education, but now we have had 2 prime ministers in this country which were women, and we have a majority of women on almost every educational level. And what this has to do with trans people? Well, it used to be like this, that women were not so clever. I remember my dear old mother, when I tried to explain her that I was transgendered. You know what she said? But you are so logical, you think so logically. Meaning, how can you be a woman when you think so logically? Which is, of course, a terrible thing to say, and otherwise it's a very logical thing to say. So she could only think like that because she was very logically thinking. So we run into an absurdity here, yeah? And the other thing I would like to stress is churches don't have so much power anymore. The church had so much power in Denmark, and I would like to add another very good thing is that people have moved away from the countryside. The countryside is a bore, and it's the big farmers and the church, and people get away from that and they get new chances to live their lives. And what I say about the church is not just the Danish church, and it's more than that. Because if you go back, I have fallen in love with an archaeologist, I don't recall her name, but she has written a very, very big book about the Vikings. And she's a feminist. And she says, for instance, I read this article the other day about excavation, I think it's called. Excavation? Yeah, when you dig up something, there was a big... Hvad fanden hedder en kæmpehøj? Hvad hedder en kæmpehøj? No, those old grave things that they have in the countryside. And you all know the word kæmpehøj in English? I don't. Well, what? Can you hear what they say? Oh, a burial hill, that's a good word. Yeah. This specific burial hill near Roskilde Fjord was 3,000 years old, and it was a woman, and only a woman in that very, very big burial hill. And when they found the remains of the woman, she had all kinds of stuff which showed that she has been a shaman, or whatever you would call it. She had snake bones, all different kinds of animal stuff, which shows that she had some religious position in her community, and that she had priest-like position. Then came the Christian church, and it was all over, with women in in dominant positions. And it's not that I mind people are Christians, but it's a historical fact that when Christianity came, well, it's only a new thing that you have female priests. So for hundreds of years, women lost their position in society. And it has to do with being transgender, because it has to do with the binary system of the society. You have to be a man to be in power. And I don't say that 3,000 years ago everybody lived a happy life. I'm not that stupid. But it was not that binary, because you could have women in power. And I would like to recommend a book that I just started reading the other day. It's a Indian, like she's from India. She's called Arundhati Roy or something like that. And the book is called The Ministry for the Utmost Happiness. And she's a very famous writer. She made one book, and then she didn't write another book in 20 years. But this book has a lot about trans people from India. And just the fact that trans people have existed constantly without interruption in India from then, I don't know from when, from always till today, whereas we have disappeared for centuries in Europe, which is very interesting. And I don't know if I so much want somebody to write a book about why this happened.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody has written it, but I have not heard about it. So the change is women get more power, church goes back. And that has happened since I was a child or very young, and what is happening now. That is why we don't see so many in my age group, simply because, well, I don't know why they're not here now, things have changed, but it's different now. The country, the nation, Europe is different, and I don't say that we have equality of all, and it's not like that, but it has changed.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm wondering if you two also maybe have like either some reflections on the age gaps or on what it is that we're losing when we don't have these relationships across generations.
Well, in Guatemala, I didn't met anything older than 35 because everybody was dying. Everybody was dying. It's like the violence or HIV or drugs or whatever refugee these women were looking, and I talk about women because my activism has to be very centric in trans women. So I never had the opportunity to talk to somebody older than 35, I guess. And we were living so chaotic lives that we didn't care much to talk about what we're going to do to change the world, right? And then we started to work together. We were young people, so we didn't have access to information. When I came here, I have the luck to meet Elizabeth, and as I have said, it's a huge honor to have your friendship, because now I can see life from your perspective, the lack of things that you had. And I think in Denmark, maybe young people are not interested, or older people are not accessible to give information like you were saying. And I think my life is better because I have a friend like Elizabeth, because I can see how is it to be a successful trans woman in your 50s when I met you, in your 60s now. And I can only be proud of having you as a friend. And I think we need to encourage and move ourselves into mixing our ages in our activism and in our daily lives also. I remember somebody asking me, what can I do to be less transphobic and be more inclusive in my life? And then I go like, invite me to one of your parties, or invite me to dinner with your group, and be friends with me. And I think like, what can we do to get that knowledge that we are missing? And that is a huge part of history that we are missing, is invite people who is older than you to your table. to your parties. Include them in your circle. Have an interest to know where our activism comes from and where do we come from as trans people. So I think like that would be an easy way to start to milk the knowledge and not make it lose in time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. And then I think that there's also one more thing, and that's like definitions. Like when times change, then definitions also change. And I think that we need to think about that when I'm talking to Elizabeth or someone older than you, then you're used to use some other terms that I use now. So when I came into Transaktivisme, I met these older trans persons, and they didn't like the word queer. They didn't like the word transgender because they were used to use the words transsexual, and it was like really binary. And they didn't want to listen to me because I just came with these new definition and terms, and they couldn't like see themselves in them. And then me, on the other hand, I was also really arrogant. I was like, okay, then I don't want to talk to you because it's not called transsexualism and it's not called And I think that we should be better at like respecting the terms and the definitions that we are using, and then talk about why we use those different definitions at those times. And then I'm sure that we're actually at the same page. And I think that I should think about that also when in 20 years maybe we're not using the term queer anymore or trans man, and then I'm the one who should respect the new terms and the new definitions. But we have to do that like the young people have to respect the older ones, and the older ones have to respect the younger ones. And I think that what we're going to lose, if we don't do that, we're going to lose our own history. But we're also going to lose hope. I mean, I would love to see some older trans men out there, so I could see myself and see that there is actually a happy life in front of me. There is, I can go out and live there, but right now I can't see it. I can't see myself as a 50-year-old trans man because I don't see them out there. So I lose hope, I lose my future, and I think that we lose our own future. And we deserve happy lives, but it's really, really hard to know that you have a happy life in front of you when you can't see that. And I think that we're losing that also when we don't see each other and talk to each other.
Also, it's like, sorry, when we are in an age gap, we need to learn and to open up about learning and calling out. Like somewhere, sometime, somebody older have said something that we don't use anymore, that maybe don't mean, but you have to call them out. You have to, and if they are open enough to want to learn, it's gonna shape a better community, definitely. I mean, let's stop being afraid of confrontation and let's bring to the table the difficult conversations. That is the most important. Like, let's talk about racism. Let's talk about transphobia in the gay community. Let's talk about race and all the intersectionalities that being a person and a human being is, in this case, trans, right? So, yeah, don't be afraid to call them out and don't be afraid to learn new things. I think that is something very important.
I would just make a remark about the very nice words Ramona said about me, but it's a kind of strange thing. Sorry, I had another person in my head. Ferndan, of course. I mean, like, I can see the importance of knowing somebody older than you. At least there is one good thing about that. It is to know you don't have to die before you that young, yeah? And as an older person, I have the pleasure of getting to know things I didn't know. Because we talked a bit about, like, I didn't think of the world of Madonna. I thought she was awful. and then I really still don't like her. But other people enjoyed her a lot, and so I learned new stuff. Yeah. So it's always good to know somebody else, somebody who's different from you, and it's not just gender. It's also the people with another cultural background for you. If you don't have anybody who's born in Turkey, or had parents who came from Turkey, or anybody from Algeria or anywhere else, go learn of some of them, because they're nice people, and it opens your mind.
And I think also like the other way around, when you're like a young trans kid, it's so important to have people who are a bit older than you that you can reflect yourself in. And also a lot of, especially maybe young people in our communities might not have access to a family or have contact with their families. So it's also amazing to be able to have figures in your communities who can be parental figures or who can be a grandparent to you. And I think those are also relationships that we should build in our communities. Maybe before we open up for questions from people here in the tent, and also online questions, we still haven't received any, but you're welcome to send them. And also for you here in the tent, I guess you could also log on to the streaming and send some questions. Okay, we already have one actually from Paulie, so maybe just we can just start with that.
Okay, first of all, I have to say I love you all so much. From your different perspectives, from asylum seeking and sex work, from trans-specific healthcare, and from all the work that you guys have been doing, there's one thing in common that it actually affects me directly, and it's one of the things that I want to work the most in activism and transactivism nowadays, and that is the pandemic, but not this one. The first fucking pandemic that almost eradicated our community, and that was HIV. And I want to talk about specifically about straight trans women and gay trans men that was coming back to the gap between the different generations that were basically eradicated. It was like the trans men and women that died during this period are the trans men and women that should be 40 and 50 right now. And it's so clear that they're not around. So my question is, how have you experienced the crisis of HIV? Because some of you were really young, some of you were like right in the middle of it, and we all had to deal with it. And by the way, Transaction is gonna start a seropositive group very soon. So everyone who's trans and is HIV positive is more than welcome to contact me.
Well, I guess I started my activism in the 2000s, you know, so it wasn't like the crisis. There started to be treatment and everything, but it was also this stigma about it, right? There was this scare to say it, to share it, to admit that you were living with it, and it had evolved a lot these past 20 years. I'm very proud to know people who are out there, and they are having amazing lives, and they are admirable, and like it changed very fast, and I'm very happy about that in my perspective, though I'm not from the 80s, you know. The thing, like now, we can say that it's not a death sentence, it's a triumph for all of us, I guess, for humanity. But I think there are so much healing that has to be done. You know, there's this word in Spanish called resarcimiento. I don't know how do you say it in English, but it's that people who live through the crisis in the 80s and people who are living with HIV, I think they need so much from society for have been living with a stigma in the dark, with so much discrimination, that it only enhances if you were a trans woman or a gay man, right? So I think we owe HIV crisis a lot, a ton, but I can see only being better now than it was when I came out 20 years ago.
Thank you for that question, Polly. I think besides having been eradicated, I think specifically with and I think this is global, but also very much within Danish radical HIV and AIDS activism, trans people have been erased from that activist history as well. I remember, I used to work for a short period of time at the AIDS Foundation, and I remember a couple of years ago listening to a former co-worker talk about the history of radical AIDS and HIV activism in Denmark, because it has a radical history, even though you might not be able to see it in the very professionalized organizational framework of the organizations today. And I was thinking all along, where are trans people in the story that you are telling me? This is fascinating, this is important, this is a root of a lot of the activism that we also see today, but where are trans people in this history that you're telling? And also, when working in organization, where are trans people in this organization? Where are trans people in your initiatives? And yeah, so these were questions that I kept asking until I did not work there anymore. But thanks to other people's continuous questions and activism, thanks to your work, Polly, also, the organization has now started to take up that question again and starting to be willing to actually talk about trans communities in relation to HIV. And there is a huge need for community and also for more accessible knowledge for trans communities about HIV. So I'm excited that we're having a group in Transaction. Did anyone else want to add something to that question?
Yeah, maybe I'll just wanna when we lose our history like that, when there's no trans people in the HIV and AIDS history, then it really affects our personal lives also. Just like to underline that means that as a trans person, I didn't even know that I was in the risk of getting that disease, because I'm not there. So when I'm going in and reading all these you can get HIV because I wasn't there. So I didn't protect myself because I wasn't there. And when I came to AIDS Funder or someone else, then they didn't know what to say to me. They didn't even know how I should protect myself. And that's just to underline how important it is that we know our history and that we are there in the history, because it really affects our personal lives. And I think a lot of especially trans people have died or have this disease because they didn't know that they could actually get it. So just yeah. Thank you.
We actually have a question now here on the screen. I'm gonna read it out loud. Your points about age gaps resonated very much with me. I find those gaps really hard to bridge. Do you have concrete ideas for how to do it? The age gaps in the communities, how can we bridge those gaps, or how can we connect more across those age gaps?
Well, as I said before, try to invite somebody to your table, to your party, to your, right, to begin with. And let's make more events like this, right? Let's fund events like this. That is the thing. We need resources, and we need to create spaces where we can learn and teach, where we can see and be seen, and we can hear and talk. And I think this is a huge initiative, and it should be amplified. And I think it's the responsibility of all the organizations to break those barriers between gaps and our personal, right? Like friend somebody who can teach you something and be open about it. That is at the top of my mind, yeah.
I'm thinking that maybe it's also about which kind of events and spaces you create in the communities and organizations. Sometimes very party-focused events or spaces, they're definitely not accessible to all people, and maybe sometimes can be intimidating for some of the older people in our communities, or inaccessible for some of the older people in our communities as well. And then maybe also doing more outreach work. So for instance, if you're in an organization where you become aware that, okay, there are no people above 40 here, then actively try to reach out to people who are above the age of 40 and get in touch with them and see what kind of initiative would you be interested in joining in our organization. And maybe also one concrete idea that we've had in Transaction that we've talked about some time ago is also doing cafes where we then can connect younger and older people, and based on the idea that I was talking about before, maybe having access to having a sort of grandparent-like relationship. I think it would be beautiful for young trans kids to be able to meet trans people who are 60 and to have a trans grandparent. So maybe that's also like actively bringing people together is one way. Anyone else for ideas for that one? No? We have a few minutes left. I'm wondering if there are other questions from the tent. I can't see any online. Yeah, there's one there.
Hi, so I'm a young trans person, and I remember growing up, I didn't really have that many supportive people in my life, and I didn't really know what to do since I was 14. But do you have any tips for young trans people about like what they could do or how they could get any communities? Because I'm 18 now, and I honest to
I think I'm low on battery. 2 seconds.
Battery? Oh, okay, yeah. So you were asking for how to get access to communities as a young trans person, am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can say that in Transaction there will be youth group coming up in the future, so you're very welcome to join. We also do lots of we do virtual hangouts at the moment in Transaction that you can also join. And then I think while it's amazing to have parent organizations, I think it's also super important for trans youth and kids to have access to other trans youth and kids, not only through parents. So yeah, write us up or join a virtual hangout or a youth group. Maybe you have some other tips across the panel for that? Yeah. Online spaces is often good for information about events as well and connecting with people. Yeah, so maybe we have 2 minutes left. I don't know if we want to... Oh, there's... Yeah. Another question? Or comment? Comments are welcome.
I think someone here is wanting to say something.
They want to... Yeah, there's a person here who wants to... Yeah, go ahead, please.
If you don't want to say something, we're going to force you.
She knew I had something on my mind. I just wanted to say to whoever spoke back there, can I hold this? I know. Oh, no. Okay, yeah, sorry, Corona. But I think I'm 22, and I also really struggle to like join people in my community. And I think people of our age kind of need to make solutions from the world that exists right now, which is brand new. I make friends on Tinder. So I like make a Tinder profile, and I'm like this. I'm non-binary. I want to find friends, and it's really hit and miss. But I think we need to make solutions for our age, and that's like completely new. I don't think we can really ask older people because they don't know the world that we live in right now. So yeah, that's how we can make friends.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, like, also as Transaction is making these initiatives to make groups for young people, to have more online presence to young people, I think it's also the responsibility of the organizations to create spaces, safe spaces, because, like, I'm terrified of what you just said. I am, like, completely, like, I'm way older than you, and I'm terrified to go on Tinder. I mean, seriously. So I think, like, we should take it more seriously to make spaces for young people so we don't put them at risk. Maybe I'm a little alarmist, but I mean, that should be a proper way to do this, right? And I think it should be our initiative and our responsibility as older and grown-ups and experience to create a little bit more safer spaces for them. So I commend Transaction for doing this, yeah, definitely. And I hope other organizations start to also copy and paste this kind of initiative, yeah.
I'm wondering if people in the panel do you have any thoughts that you want to share before we close up the conversation? No? Go ahead.
I would like to repeat myself. Burn the churches. I was just kidding.
Well, on that note, thank you everyone for listening and for being here. It was amazing to have this conversation and to have you be part of it as well. Hope to hear and see much from you in the future.
Thank you so much, everybody. A quick question to you guys. If there was anybody out here in the tent who had some questions that they might not want to ask on the live stream or anything, will you be available afterwards so that they can come up to you and ask the questions? Yeah,
definitely.
Good.
And also Transaction, we have left some cards all around in the tent, so please grab them and share them to people for whom it might be relevant.
Yes, then this was all for tonight in this tent. I hope you all had a great talk here and have a great evening. I hope you see some of you tomorrow to some of our last events at the Human Rights Program. But thank you for tonight.